All right, this is the video for ETD 73A and B. C will come later. We'll address things such as Babekbo and Ecological Succession in forests. Papers that you need for this time, of course, are the 9 papers. Go get them, Finney. The papers, of course, are the same listed on ETD 72's video. You can see them right here, so make sure that you have all those. We'll be focusing in on many of the hot topic questions, as well as the big ideas for ecology. So, biggest thing, of course, is to make us proud, people. We worked for most of the year, well, 3/4 of it now. So, go west, young frog, and conquer and divide. Now, key things, of course, dig out your ETD. Here's what you're going to write down. What is Babekbo? And then draw and explain the stages of ecological succession in a northwest forest after a forest fire. And then explain how that would be different if a glacial period or a farmer came along and plowed that field. I'll give you a second to write it down. 1 second. Now we're going to start it. If we look at Babekbo, of course, it's not a word because it's an acronym. And what Babekbo tells us about, of course, is the levels of hierarchy in living systems. Or basically, it's the hierarchy of living systems. Let me switch to a black pen. If we look at an easy way to keep track of that, it's not mine, somebody else's. It's Babekbo. And Babekbo is pretty handy. Basically, it goes from the largest levels to the smallest levels. And the largest level of living systems on Earth is that project you hated back in 8th grade. I don't know if they still do it. I invented it. Called the Biosphere Project. Of course, what the biosphere is a living sphere. It is the living skin of the Earth. It's something that humans have tried to replicate down in Arizona and failed miserably because we can't replicate the beauty and complexity of living systems on Earth. That's why nature's good at it. Biosphere, of course, is made of these things called biomes. And the biomes are different types of ecosystems. They could be things like grasslands or coral reefs or deciduous forests, or they could be the taiga, where you find taigas in Siberia and stuff like that. They're the different types of water systems and collections of animals that exist on Earth, mostly determined by temperature, water, latitude, all those things. But it's mainly water and temperature, right? Determined by latitude. If we look at the E, you hopefully figured out that E is for ecosystems. And the ecosystems are made of 2 parts. It is, of course, the biotic factors. Those are the living factors, such as all the animals, plants, fungi that are in that area. And then the abiotic, because A means not, so these are the non-living factors in an environment. They love their biotic and abiotic factors. So those things like the rocks, the chemistry of those rocks, the water that's there, the air, the amount of oxygen that's in the water, the rate of the stream's flow, all those things that are occurring in a local area. That is what an ecosystem, all the living and non-living things that make it work, right? Then the AP loves to tell the difference between the C and the P. It loves to test on the difference between C, which is a community, and P, which is a population, something we've already studied a lot in genetics, right? Now, community is a collection of all the living populations in an area. So if we're looking at your neighborhood, that would be all the dogs, the trees, the grass, the humans. Those are all part of the living populations that are there, all the biotic factors. The population itself is a collection of just one species. So that's why we looked in genetics at populations of frog, populations of Drosophila, populations of pigs. It's just one species. So the population is one species. The community is a collection of different populations, a bunch of different species, right? The smallest of all, of course, is a population is made of organisms. That's the POE, right? And those are the individuals. And you should notice that, of course, the individuals are what have to face the survival and face things like natural selection, which decides whether or not the population will continue, which holds together the community, which makes the ecosystems work, which will allow the biome to succeed, and then the biosphere to succeed. So if we start taking out individuals, they're building blocks of all those different hierarchy steps that allow the whole biosphere to keep humans alive. It's almost like that creates biodiversity and survival for all of us, right? If we dig into a small section of that, we can look at an ecosystem, a biome, such as a northwest forest, right? And it faces this thing called ecological succession. And unfortunately, its name kind of tells you what's going on. If we look at this, success or successive should make you think of steps. Ecological should make you think of all the living populations that are in an area, right? In that community. So if we look at this, this is a predictable change in the composition of species in a community over time. Right? Successive steps. If you're having trouble reading my handwriting, there's nice notes for this on the PowerPoint that I provided for you that have it written where I'm not talking and blabbing at the same time. Now, cool thing is, of course, this should sound a lot like things like adaptive radiation. There is an event that occurs, right? And in that event, there's a key thing that happens. Say that there's a fire, because that's going to happen a lot more as we mess up our ecosystems. Those fires that have been hitting the Northwest, as they hit, one of the things they do is they burn up all of the living creatures that are there, all the biotic factors, right? But the key thing is after the fire settles down, there's still soil at the start. And that soil at the start is great because you don't have to build the soil first, right? This could also happen if, say, a farmer came through and he cleared out that forest. He would, of course, go and log it, which we log like crazy out here. Logging, farmers clearing, this will all lead to what's called an event, which leads to secondary succession. This means that you don't have to make soil because there's already soil there, which is great, right? So that's why it's in like secondary school. After that soil sits there for a while, it's loaded with nutrients. It's got things like phosphates and all that stuff. But this fire has done a great thing. It has opened up niches for the survivors, right? Like adaptive radiation. And it's reduced competition. So if you're a survivor or you're a pioneer and you come and invade that area, you've got opportunities available to you because there's still soil, right? So it might be thin, but it's got a lot of black stuff left over from things burned. It's rich in nutrients from all the dead bodies, right? That's when it kicks into the first stage of this. After the event, that's when the pioneers come in. It's called the pioneer stage. These are pioneer species, right? And the pioneers, of course, are the things that are going to take advantage of this soil first. So if you bought a new home and it has no soil or no grass on it, the first thing you'll notice is that all that dirt out there, who colonizes it first? That would be things like grassy, herbaceous plants. They float in on the wind. They, of course, land and they quickly germinate to take over that, take advantage of that spot. They also will have species like insects, which come in to feed on that grass. They tend to make a lot of babies. They tend to take a lot of care of their babies. Hey, this is an R-selected group. These are R-selected species. They're favoring quantity over quality. They're also known as the opportunists. So if we look at these opportunists, right, they're all about the quantity, not so much about the quality, which is why they quickly take advantage of this thing, right? This means in this area, we would have low biodiversity. Just a couple of pioneer species would show up and start taking over. This would be things like grasses, which are annuals. They die every single year, and they only go on to the next generation through their seeds or through the roots in some types of grasses, right? This could also be things like Scotch broom, which could then take advantage very quickly of this as it is doing here, and insect species, right? All of these species can take what you're going to get hit with a lot here. You're going to get hit with a lot of sunshine because there's no trees. So this is going to be a very hot environment. It's going to be very, very dry because it's cooking off the soil all the time. And there's going to be high sun. So you need species that can handle that. And that means you need what are called sun tolerant species, which are also called shade intolerant species. Not that I have a list, right? Now, after they establish that for a while, their roots are going to hold on to soil, give it some shade. That's going to slightly increase the amount of water that's in the soil. As they die, they'll slightly increase the organic matter, OM, that's in the soil. That makes the soil a little bit richer, especially if you do it for a couple of million years like it did in the prairies of North America, right? Really rich soil will start to develop and get better, but it'll be slow, right? If you get enough of that soil, then you start to see the next stage, and that's where shrubs start to show up. And a shrub is a woody plant. So we start to see things like the Scotch broom starts to really grow woody extensions, or blackberry starts to take over this area. These blackberries and these shrubs are putting a bigger investment into the next generation. As the shrubs start to show up, these woody plants, we start to show bigger investment in their babies. So these become the start of the K-selected species. They, of course, are stable in their growth. They're slow and steady is kind of their motto, right? And what that means, of course, is they're looking for the equilibrium strategy. They're trying to grow for the long term, not the speed. Now, as they do this, of course, they're favoring a little bit of quality over quantity, but that means they're going to grow slower. As they do that, they create something below them. They create shade. That shading means that the grass species underneath them tends to start to struggle a bit. But the leaf litter from those shrubs is starting to add to the soil as well. Increasing amounts of shade means, of course, an increasing amount of moisture in the soil. This would mean a decrease in the amount of sun. This also means that you'd have an increase in the organic matter in the soil and the water capacity of it, so the soil starts to get richer and richer. Along with that, we start to see something that loves shrubs, not only the insects, but birds. As birds and insects start to increase in their variety in this area, we start to see biodiversity go up, right? We're increasing the number of species in the area. Some of the species are going extinct, but we're seeing more species show up. We start to see the herbaceous plants start to disappear because they are, of course, shade intolerant. They can't handle the shade, right? Or I'm sorry, they are shade intolerant. There we go. So they start to die off. So as we do that, we start to get to these plants that, can take the shade. And that's when we really kick into the third stage where small trees start to appear, right? Underneath all of those bushes, there were a couple of trees that may have helicoptered their way in, right? Or blown in on the wind or been carried there by a squirrel, and they start to grow in this area. These would be things like Douglas squirrel or alder trees in our area. And these trees are relatively fast-growing trees. The alders and the Douglas, they are the pioneer trees. Now, what they're doing is they're faster growing, so they're softer wood, right? And being softer wood means they can put on rings faster, grow higher and higher. And as they do that, they increase the amount of shade. And this is going to favor even more those that are shade tolerant, or what we could say are sun intolerant species. It goes hand in hand. Now, this means that we're shifting away from the sun tolerant to the sun intolerant, and from the shade intolerant to from the shade tolerant, the shade intolerant to the shade tolerant. They can handle the shade, they grow slow, but eventually they grow over and then they shade the plants below them. What that does is it starts to decrease the grasses and the shrubs because it's competing for that resource, which is the sunlight. At the same time, more shade means more water, more organic matter, richer soil, right? Hey, and as we do that, now we're not just getting birds and insects and stuff. We're getting things like rabbits and deer that are living in this area. That's a beautiful deer. And as they do that, there's more food options. There's places for the birds to nest in the trees at different levels. So we're increasing biodiversity, a common theme of the idea here, right? More species over time. Forest creates the shade. Eventually, if that continues for, say, a couple of hundred to thousands of years, you can end up with the end of the story called the climax of the story, the climax community. That climax community will be dominated by these small little trees that grew over them and eventually dominate that area. Now, these trees, of course, are the ones that are very slow growing, but they grow huge. They are shade tolerant species. And our area is named after them. These are maple trees. These are oak trees in the East Coast. These are things like cedar trees and hemlock trees. They're all shade tolerant. They grow slow and steady. And as they do that, they eventually dominate this area. And when they do that, many of the bushes, except for things that are shade tolerant like salal and all the ferns that we have in our area, the other species tend to go extinct because they're shade intolerant. Now, the cool thing is with this multi-layered forest with vine maples and large maples, that's increasing the shade dramatically, which means more water because it's not getting kicked off by the sun. This means years and years and millions of years of organic matter collecting. This means really rich soil. And what do you find in areas that have this climax old growth forest? Well, you find the greatest biodiversity. You find it loaded with things like bear and elk and cougar and wolves. There's a small patch of this that's left over by the old Tahoma Middle School now. It used to be the junior high that had pileated woodpeckers and bears that would be in the area because there's a variety of food at different levels in it. It's a much richer and healthier ecosystem because it has more niches. Now, that would, of course, be an admirable thing, but hey, I want to build a house, so I cut down the cedar tree, the maple tree, and I clear cut all this, and I take it all the way back after thousands of years back to soil. Or it rains really hard, and it gets rid of all that soil. Well, that would, if it got rid of all that soil because of erosion, that would take it back to what's called primary succession. And primary succession is where you have to build soil first. And this would happen with things like, say, you came in and you had a massive erosion event because of improper logging practices, which there's breaking down and trying to stop now, but it still continues in places like the Amazon, right? If you have no soil, that means you have to build the soil first. So lichen have to come in, take over the rocks, and with fungus conspire to turn rocks gradually into soil, which means that this is going to take thousands of years. And thousands of years, of course, means that you've really messed up the rate at which the amount of biodiversity can increase. Now, other things that would work just like this, that would scrape away the soil, say you have an ice age and a glacier shows up. Go up to the top of Mount Rainier and you can see primary succession where glaciers recently scraped down that. You can see the scrapes on the rocks. There's no soil. And gradually, lichen is starting to work on the rocks and turn into soil. Or the most famous of all, it's called Pave Paradise. Put up a parking lot. We could have a lava flow from a volcano like Mount St. Helens, or we could have a modern lava flow called a parking lot, like we have when we built our new school. It used to be a forest, it used to be a golf course. When you take that in and clear cut all that stuff, of course, you take it back to sidewalks and no soil. Now, if humans disappeared, after a couple of 100 years, that would gradually grow over with moss. It would start to form soil. And after thousands and thousands of years, it would turn back into a forest if we let it. But maybe after, COVID-19 has its way with us, and the next one comes along, there will be a chance for a climax community to form in our area again. This can also happen in things like a lake, where a lake is nice and warm. It starts to fill in with species, and that fills up with species. Eventually, it fills up so much that it becomes a wetland, a mature lake. This is the idea of eutrophication in the lake, the death of the lake, but the evolution of a wetland area. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you the 1 minute break or whatever. You can take as long a break as you need, and we'll continue in the next video with ETD 73. Our focus with this one was BECPO, all the layers, the levels of hierarchy in living systems, and then succession, both secondary and primary succession. So if you see a tree, you should probably hug it because, it took thousands of years to establish the ecosystem to have it. Thanks for listening.